Let's remember what fascism is. Fascism is when the business and government coalesce to further the interests of business and government, not the interests of the people.
So what's the quotation? False opinions rarely do any damage because everyone enjoys refuting them, but false facts can be highly injurious because they last long, right? And similarly, there's another line that the problem with a lie or misrepresentation isn't the extent to which it's contrary to the truth. The problem is the extent to which it resembles the truth and then passes by, as a form of, I mean, lies that are ridiculous or outrageous, lies such as Donald Trump might tell you, are not that dangerous. The problem is, I mean, the reason I'm making this video is that Jimmy Dore, fellow political commentator here on YouTube, a colleague of mine, in fact, when you think about it, Jimmy Dore, he uses this line of reasoning on fascism all the time, and it's false. I mean, he completely means well. He's not trying to deceive anyone, but this is a really misleading statement about fascism. So look, I got a comment not too long ago asking me, Eisel, why are you always criticizing communism and the far left, and much more rarely am I using examples, such as World War II, the Nazis. Well, sorry, it's not even World War II, but specifically Nazis and fascism. And I wrote back saying, honestly, the lessons to be learned from the critique of the far left, I still really think are meaningful and important and applicable in a lot of our political problems today. When I look at the mix of motivations and what people were trying to achieve and the particular ideals involved, wanting to help the poor, wanting to have a society based on equality, wanting to address certain types of justice and injustice, even, workplace ethics. How do you organize a union? How do you organize your workplace? I mean, how do you deal with the gap between rich and poor? There are a lot of thematic concerns communism raises that are still really meaningful in people's everyday lives. And when I look at the footage of that rally, the Unite the Right rally in Charlotte, VA, Charlottesville. That's what you heard from my sweet. Thank you. Got Melissa off camera. Charlottesville, not Charlotte. Charlottesville, Virginia. This is filming in Canada. Born and raised in Canada, people. All right. Yeah, okay. So, the footage of that. I mean, sorry, if you see the footage, there were 3 different rallies, and one of them is overtly KKK people, and one of them is overtly neo-Nazi people, and I mean, it's just laughable. They're engaged in a political discourse that, in this sense, I think has no applicable or incredibly little applicability to serious political problems people are still wrestling with today. So this comes up less often on my channel. We study history not for what it can subtract from the past, but for what it adds to the present. I mean, that's why these things come up. And, look, also, even when you do have something in parallel, so to give an example, the Nazis, the fascists in the mid-20th century, they engaged in ethnic cleansing of a very direct and overt form. They massacred people. They engaged in mass murder in a direct way. Joseph Stalin, how did he deal with the Kets? K-E-T-S. The Kets are one of many indigenous peoples within the Soviet Union. He dealt with them. It's shocking how similar it is. He dealt with them in almost exactly the same way that Canada was dealing with its own indigenous people at that time. Not with gas chambers, but with a system of forced assimilation, separating children from their families through, making them into orphans and adopting them, forcing them to learn a new language, forcing them to give up their religion and culture. It was a kind of slow-motion genocide and forced integration program. I've also done some research on indigenous peoples of Sakhalin Island, the furthest east, fringes of the Soviet Empire, where, how Native people were treated. So when you study what it did that was so terrible, there are useful parallels, there are lessons to be learned that apply to what we were doing wrong in the West in the same period of time, really directly. Whereas in some ways the evils of fascism are just that little bit more outlandish, where it's not easy to look at, Treblinka. So Treblinka was one of the death camps, and see right away the parallels to the type of slow motion genocide that Canada was involved in, whereas a lot of those left-wing regimes did engage in modes of repression, forced assimilation, slow motion genocide that we really should examine, and we should examine our own record and so on too. So that's why I engage in so much criticism that way. Now, the other thing is, I think everyone knows this by the internet, there are a lot of kind of memes about this, like, oh, the minute someone mentions Adolf Hitler, like the discussion is over. As soon as you start making comparisons to the Nazis, the conversation's kind of gone on the toilet. So I'm also against the sort of lazily invoking, the memory of fascism and Adolf Hitler to prove a point. But that's not Jimmy Dore's problem. What Jimmy Dore does is that he really fundamentally misidentifies or incorrectly defines fascism.
Let's remember what fascism is. Fascism is when the business and government coalesce.
And he does this again and again and again. He does it in a way that's plausible enough that I'm concerned it will kind of influence people in the next generation. As he says in this clip, and not the first time I've heard him say it, I don't know, I've heard him say it over a dozen times, I think. He considers to be fascism the integration of, private sector and government, right? Now, there's actually a totally different term for that school of thought, and it's neither left-wing nor right-wing, or neither exclusive. It's syndicalism. So syndicalism, yeah, my girlfriend's just looking surprised. Syndicalism is one of the most important political philosophies of the 20th century that did not make it into the 21st century. That's significant in its way, right? It's like if you hear about someone who was a famous author for 20 or 30 years and then totally forgotten. There's some interesting story there. Syndicalism made it big. And syndicalism, to dumb it down a bit, there's a period of time when a lot of people were enthusiastic about labor unions. And a lot of people were enthusiastic about the workers taking over the means of production. So some of those people were left-wing, some of those people were nationalists, or sometimes even, right-wing or fascists. There was nothing inherently left-wing or even liberal about the idea that the workers could take over the factory. And that's itself a lesson worth learning. The world could have paid more attention to that. So syndicalism in general was the philosophy, and there were several different leaders of it, several different schools of thought within it. The most important by far, I think, is Georges Sorel, and I have read Primary Source of Georges Sorel. So this is from memory, but after Georges Sorel died, as I recall, both the fascists and the communists offered to build a monument over his tomb, to put up some kind of statue or pillar or something to commemorate him. So both the left and the right were interested in claiming his legacy. But if you were to ask why did syndicalism, why was it such a big deal in the 20th century, and then was of no interest in the 21st century, I think part of the reason is that it was discredited by its flirtation with fascism, or fascism's flirtation with it, whichever way you want to look at it. And also the other philosophy that it was really associated with was anarchism. And people still use the term anarcho-syndicalism. And, the results were not promising. You can still to this day meet people on the internet who will absolutely swear that for a period of 3 years, anarcho-syndicalism in Spain and Catalonia operated a couple factories and it wasn't so bad, and so on and so forth. There are people who will go to their graves saying that anarcho-syndicalism is a viable way to reorganize society. But when it comes down to it, what Jimmy Dore is criticizing here as fascism is not fascism. It's the related, important, and separate economic and political philosophy of syndicalism. And quite possibly it's specifically Sorelian syndicalism. You can look it up. There are a couple other schools within syndicalism. And today, everyone's forgotten about it, and nobody talks about it. It doesn't matter. Fascism. Right, so we've now returned the book to the library. I was going to show on camera the symbol of fascism, in terms of understanding what fascism is properly defined. I had a copy here of Cicero's The Republic. And on the cover of that, on both sides of the title, there was a very peculiar symbol. And that symbol was the fasces of ancient Rome bound up with a leather cord, I believe, right? And this is the same symbol that's used on the fascist flag of Italy, and mutatis mutandis with variations. The fascists in Spain and other countries all claim this symbol. This symbol, and even the word fascism, comes from the fasces, These were the rods that were carried by basically aristocrats in Rome, especially when walking to the Senate. And they were rods that would be carried in front of them, and anyone who got in their way could be beaten with them. Now, what a lovely symbol for political, the rods used to beat people. But the idea was that when these aristocrats met at the meeting, they would each set down their rod, and it would be bound together in a bundle, representing that the men inside were not going to raise arms against each other while the meeting progressed. So the other thing that was striking me, I didn't know this until I read Cicero. I always just thought, okay, so the rod was meant to beat people, and that's the end of the story. But no, within the history of Rome, it was actually seen as progress when the aristocrats stopped carrying axes, when they took the axe heads off the axes and just went out with rods. So the rod was a less violent alternative to the earlier symbol of their, privilege and power, which was going around with an axe. And I don't even think it's that the men would carry themselves. Their slaves or their servants or their guards would be walking ahead of them, holding an axe or a rod, wooden stave. So look, understanding what fascism really is and where it came from historically, for me, was difficult because of we talked about this off camera a couple days ago, a really interesting example of bias in education. My education about World War II and the 20th century was totally focused on Germany. It was specifically the history of fascism in Germany. And if you only study that, you'll really never understand what fascism was or what it is, because the origins of fascism in Europe are almost uniquely Italian. So something everyone knows is that the word Nazi is a contraction of National Socialist. But what most people don't know is, how is it that the term socialist came to be combined with nationalist and not to mean a left-wing group, but to mean an extreme right-wing group? And the etiology of that, the sequence of events, to understand, you absolutely must study Italy. It's specifically and uniquely out of the conditions in Italy. Basically, there were many socialists who were genuinely, at the start of this story, were genuinely left-wing socialists in the same sense that we use the word today. But during World War I, so World War I, in case you don't know, was an unpopular war, especially for people who weren't winning it, but the body count was incredibly high. During World War I, broadly speaking, the left was anti-war, critical of the war, especially as the years went by, as the body count piled up. So within Italy, there were socialists, and at least at the start of the story, I think they probably were sincere socialists. They were socialists who wanted to identify themselves as pro-war, as nationalists. And this was the origin of the term National Socialist. And there was the unique and bizarre historical figure whose political career is really impossible to summarize, of Mussolini. And Mussolini made the switch from being, I think, not just a socialist, but a communist. He went from being a far-left demagogue to being an extreme right demagogue. And indeed, he did. We now have the archival research published. People didn't know, but we actually know exactly when he first became anti-Semitic, when he first took on other aspects of fascism, properly called. He had very different, perspectives on politics in other periods of his life. So I just say, understanding what fascism really was and what it really is. Nobody in my education system was trying to lie to me about this. It wasn't like the Canadian Public School Board wanted to mislead me. But I think there's a real sense of discomfort. I grew up around a lot of Italians. Where I was in downtown Toronto, we had a lot of Italians, new immigrants as well as old community and so on. There was a real reluctance, I think, to make the Italians into the villains of World War II. I think there was a real reluctance to trace the origins of fascist ideology to Italy. But it utterly is. It utterly and ineluctably does originate in Italy. And it originates in a unique set of political circumstances. Sure, just like, where do our terms left-wing and right-wing come from? It's worth understanding in the French Revolution, after the French Revolution, creating the first parliament in France and so on, the Revolutionary Parliament, there were these unique conditions and these unique associations with the terms that then lasted, centuries thereafter. They've been tremendously longstanding. Their influence has been tremendously longstanding. In the same way, there were really unique and bizarre political conditions in Italy during World War I that then shaped the emergence of fascism proper in the interwar years, and that in turn shaped the history of Germany and shaped the history of the world. And that is how we've ended up with this. I mean, the literal symbol of the fasces, of the rod, and this very eclectic mix of ideas that don't seem to naturally fall together. I mean, eugenics, racism, but indeed, as Jimmy Dore mentioned, syndicalism is an aspect of it. The aspect of, shall we say, removing the intermediaries, removing the barriers between government and industry. Whether you think of that as government taking over industry or the workers taking over industry or what have you, there are definitely different schools of thought in that. This eclectic mix of ideas and really a set of excuses of convenience, ultimately, for how it was that people like Mussolini ended up crossing the aisle and going from the extreme left wing to the extreme right wing. And at that time, remember, they would be taking over the right wing from what had been traditional monarchists, traditional Christians and Catholics, people who were traditionally, hysterically anti-communist. And these were really people taking ideas from left-wing syndicalists, communism and socialism, and bringing them into the right wing as never before, and transforming the history of the Western world as never before. Okay, so shout out to Jimmy Dore. As Jimmy Dore always likes to say, he's just a nightclub performer. He doesn't do any research on these things. Every so often somebody asks him a question about Marxism, and he says, hey, look, he's just a nightclub performer. And this is, I think, an example of lazy thinking that's kind of crept into his act. Dun, 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 dun.